Time for our topic of the week now. The government is preparing a deregulation measure to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers in response to United States high tariff threat, as well as the rising uncertainties in the global market. While the deregulation is expected to spur economic growth, it can also hurt our local companies.
Presiden sudah memberikan instruksi untuk kita melakukan deregulasi.
The deregulation plan was announced by President Prabowo Subianto during a meeting with the National Economic Council, or DEN, on March the 19th. During the meeting, the president asked for massive deregulation to boost competitiveness, create employment, and increase investment in labor-intensive industries. The chairman of the National Economic Council, Luhut Panjaitan, told journalists in a press briefing. The deregulation will be issued in a formal regulatory package that will include easing of regulations that hinder investment and exports, revision of the local component level or TKDN requirement, licensing procedures, and removal of import quotas, as well as reduction of import tariffs. In another meeting in Jakarta early April, the president also repeated his call for the removal of the TKDN regulation. According to President Prabowo, the regulation on the TKDN, often being criticized for impeding major foreign investment for causing high costs, should be made more flexible so that it would not scare away major foreign investors. The president acknowledged that the regulation was intended to encourage foreign companies to transfer their technology and support local companies. However, this regulation is considered to be inhibiting and contrary to the principles of free trade. The American Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia has consistently criticized the local content regulation, labeling it a significant barrier to investment and trade. Under the local content requirement, both foreign and local industries are obliged to use parts of their components from the local market. For instance, mobile phone devices sold in Indonesia must have at least 35% of local content. Recently, the government blocked the sale of the iPhone 16 in October 2024 due to Apple's failure to meet local investment regulations. President Prabowo also called for the removal of import quotas, particularly for commodities crucial to the livelihoods of the people, in order to reduce favoritism and benefit the wider public. At present, import quota policy is implemented on several commodities such as salt, sugar, and meat. The policy is intended to protect local producers from unfair competition against cheaper imports. Meanwhile, Finance Minister Sri Mulyani said the Finance Ministry will also lower import duties as part of the deregulation plan. For example, by cutting income tax on imports from 2.5% to 0.5% on certain products such as electronics, mobile phones, and laptops. Import duties for all U.S. products will also be cut from between 5% and 10% to 0% and 5%. Commenting on the deregulation plan, Center of Reform on Economics, or CORE Indonesia researcher Yusuf Rendi Manilet said that the deregulation is indeed important to open up to international trade. However, he reminded that free trade policy must be mutually beneficial and must be carefully designed so as not to harm domestic industries. Free trade will trigger influx of imports, which will in turn threaten domestic companies, especially weak ones. The deregulation is needed to stimulate competition and reduce costs. However, the government should also support small business either through financial helps or marketing assistance so that they will be able to survive despite the tight competition in the local market.
President Prabowo Subianto's administration will soon launch a deregulation measure that will remove tariff and non-tariff barriers in order to stimulate economic growth amid the rising global uncertainties. So today on our dialogue, we have Bapak Mohammad Faisal, the Executive Director of CORE Indonesia, and we will talk about the urgency of the government's plan to launch this deregulation measure. Hello, Pak Faisal, how are you?
Hello, I'm good, thank you. How are you,
I'm
Mbak
great, Pak
Luisa?
Faisal. Glad to have you back here on Economic Outlook today. Now, Pak Faisal, President Prabowo Subianto has ordered a deregulation measure, which will include the removal of tariff and non-tariff barriers to sustain the economic growth in this rising global uncertainties. How do you see the urgency of having this deregulation measure at this point of time?
Well, I believe that we have a number of issues our regulations, especially those relating to investments, foreign investments in Indonesia. We have currently high incremental capital output ratio for manufacturing, which impede investments. We have problems with red tapes, labor productivity, talents, inconsistent regulations, and also restrictions on import, especially imports of raw materials that have impeded certain manufacturing industries in Indonesia. So in this case, the regulations is relevant to address these issues, especially those who is still dependent on imports of raw materials and supporting goods. But on the other hand, at the same time, we also have issues for our domestic manufacturing industry. That includes a recent increase of layoffs, limited job creations, which is also urgent to be solved in the short run. So imports for raw materials and supporting goods is something that we need to push to to support the productive activities in Indonesia to create jobs and also to increase export and of course we'll be able to spur economic growth. But we also need to be careful in designing the policy because for some industries, the problems is also because of due to the influx of imports, especially for finished products. If we look at the textile product manufacturing industries, many of the many of the problems also not only the legal but also the illegal finished products. So we should have a mapping of industry because import will have different impacts among different industries. And that also questions of how the deregulations will be able to spur economic growth, how it is designed to address the current.
All right, Pak
It is
Faisal. Mhm.
it is a matter of solving the domestic problems. That's why it should be carefully designed.
We need to be careful in determining how this will be effective in accordance with the different
Yeah.
sectors in the industry. Pak Faisal, if the TKDN is removed, what should our government do to encourage our foreign investors to still use locally made products and encourage transfer of technology?
But if not TKDN, then we should have a set of regulations in the form of incentives and disincentives, which requires the investors of targeted sectors to ensure transfer of technology. It can be through trainings or capacity building, but the bottom line is that the transfer of technology indeed requires government's enforcement to the investors, because without government intervention, it is difficult for investors to transfer the technology because this is something that part of their competitive advantage. So, but without a transfer of technology, we will be stagnant in terms of our industrial technology advancement. So that's why we still need a set of regulations, a set of incentives and disincentives, which can ensure transfer of technology from the private sector investors.
There's a lot of preparation that we need to have before
Yeah.
actually implementing this deregulation process. Now, in addition to the TKDN, the government will also remove import quotas for a number of commodities such as beef, as well as sugar and rice. Pak Faisal, do you think that this removal of import quota will then threaten our local producers? And if so, then how can our government make sure that our local producers is still protected and not let this plan backfire?
Yeah. We can understand that import quota tends to be abused by certain importers to monopolize imports, which distort the market. But at the same time, import quota removal will also tend to threaten local producers, especially when we have the capacity to produce the commodities domestically. Maybe not so much for beef or sugar because we still import dependence for these commodities, beef and sugar. But for rice, I think it will have an adverse impact larger than the other commodities because rice is a sensitive commodity for Indonesia. And in many aspects, it is the largest contributor to domestic inflation. So that's why we need to very carefully to treat import quota removals, especially for commodity or sensitive commodities such as rice.
Be very careful about this matter. And
Yeah,
Pa Faisal, you mentioned early on about the textile industry. At the moment, there are a
yeah.
wave of layoff that is currently continuing in the textile and footwear industries as more and more factories
Mm.
are shutting down for being unable to compete. This indicates that the government's policy has failed to help them so far. So, Pa Faisal, what will be what is the weakness of the existing industrial policy, and hence, what should the government do then to stop this continuous layoff that is still currently happening in our country?
Well, in general, we have high production costs in across many industries, and that includes logistical costs, energy costs, and including also labor costs. For certain labor-intensive industries, we also have additional problems, such as, for example, textile product industries. Many of them are still using old machinery, so machinery revitalization is the thing that we need to push. We need to ensure for these labor intensive industries, so they can increase their productivity and at the same become more competitive. And at the same time, for many labor intensive industries, we also have problems with harmonization of tariffs, especially for between import of raw materials and sporting goods and import of finished products. Often, the tariffs for importing finished products is lower than the tariff for raw materials. This is something that is not harmonized because what we need to ensure production, especially for labor-intensive industries, is cheap raw materials and cheap supporting goods imports. But there should be more higher tariff for the finished products, so they can be more competitive in the domestic markets. What happens usually the other way around, so in the opposite. So this harmonized regulations is also part of the problems of the many labor-intensive industries, and that's why the government needs to tackle these various issues so that they can increase their productivity and then also become more competitive, not only in the domestic market, but also in the export market.
So the government really has a lot of homework to be done in this sector, especially
Yes,
in order to increase our competitiveness. Bapak Mohammad
right.
Faisal, thank you so much for sharing your insights on Economic Outlook today, and we'll be very happy to have you back again on Economic Outlook next time. Thank you, Pak.